amongst Aboriginal lore and legends and that kind of thing, there are things that we sort of UFO researchers and paranormal researchers would perhaps seem to approximate or equate to UFO type of events.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America Audio, with your host, Tim Binnall.
Hello out there, my friends. This is Tim Binnall of BinnallofAmerica.com with another edition of BOA Audio Season 3. It is May 18th, 2008, and we have got a real barn burner of an episode for you. It is part one of a two-part, lengthy conversation with Australian ufologist Bill Chalker. That's right, my friends, we are returning to Down Under as we once again explore the international UFO scene. In this first installment, we're going to be discussing the history of the UFO phenomenon in Australia, ranging from Aboriginal times to pre-1947 cases, and noteworthy sightings from the UFO boom of the 1950s. Along the way, we're going to find out about the various trends and UFO flaps that occurred in Australia over the years, along with the explosion in abduction research from the 1990s onward. We'll be hearing about key cases like the 1954 Sea Fury incident, the Father Gill case, and the Mundrobilla case of 1988, among many others. Bill will also describe in depth his forensic investigation into an alleged abduction that ended up spawning his book, Hair of the Alien. This is some fascinating research that Bill has done, CSI style, on the abduction phenomenon that is really some riveting material. Altogether, it's another international showcase for BOA Audio as we continue our investigation of the global aspect of ufology with Australian ufologist Bill Chalker. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Bill Chalker, let me give you a little bit of background on him. Bill Chalker was born in Grafton, New South Wales, Australia, was educated at the University of New England, graduated with an honours science degree, with majors in chemistry and mathematics. Since 1975, he has worked in the food industry as an industrial chemist, laboratory manager, and quality manager. Bill Chalker is one of Australia's leading UFO researchers and has written extensively on the subject. He is a contributing editor to the International UFO Reporter and coordinates the New South Wales UFO Investigation Centre. He was the Australian representative for the Aerial Phenomena Research Organisation, APRO, from 1978 to 1986, and the New South Wales State Representative for the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, from 1976 to 1993. In 1996, Bill's book about the Australian UFO experience, The Oz Files, The Australian UFO Story, was published in Australia by Duffy and Snellgrove. 2005 saw the publication of his second book, Hair of the Alien, which details his forensic investigation into the Peter Corey abduction case. His websites are www.theozfiles.com and ozfiles.blogspot.com. Be sure to check out those great sites. Without any further ado, let's rock and roll. This interview was recorded on April 21st, 2008, Part 1 of Bill Chalker talking about Australian ufology on BOA Audio Season 3. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very special edition of Binnall of America Audio. As many of you know, I love international ufology. It's one of the key areas of the esoteric that I've always been fascinated about and have kind of made an aim of the show over the last year to really explore international esoterica. And longtime listeners will remember our last year's episode with Tony Healy when we discussed the Yowie in Australia. I have a very keen interest and fascination with Australia in and of itself. I really love Australia. It's one of the places I would love to go see and visit and check out. So when I connected over the spring here with Bill Chalker, noted Australian ufologist, I knew it was time to return to Down Under and explore more esoterica from Australia, namely the UFO phenomenon and the UFO scene in Australia, and I think we got the perfect guest here to discuss all that. Bill Chalker, coming to us direct from Sydney, Australia, 14-hour time difference. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on Binnall of America Audio.
My pleasure, Tim.
Excellent. Well, let's start out with the bio, the background. You know, who is Bill Chalker, and how did you become interested in the UFO phenomenon?
Well, I guess my interest sort of really started as a young teenager in the mid-'60s. I was born in Grafton, which is a large sort of town in northern New South Wales, one of certainly the most populated state in Australia, which is on the east coast of Australia in terms of geography. And it was during the mid-'60s, 1966 in particular, that a lot of locals, including police officers, etc., were reporting sightings, and these got kind of national prominence. And as a kid, that kind of tweaked my interest. It seemed like I was one of the few people in town that wasn't seeing UFOs, etc., but it certainly struck my interest, and particularly when you had people like police officers being amongst the witnesses, and it certainly got a lot of media attention at the time. And having kind of a sort of a scientific bent, I was kind of interested in it from a mystery point of view, and I read the works of Charles Fort and a lot of the early UFO researchers out of America and the UK and that kind of thing. So it started to really drive my interest, and that interest sort of translated by the late 60s into kind of direct investigation, and certainly by the early 70s I was actively doing a lot of field work and investigations, interviewing of witnesses, that kind of thing.
Nice. I kind of said to you here before we started the interview, there's sort of various big picture tent poles, I guess you could say, that'll prop up this interview. To start it out, let's talk about the UFO phenomenon in Australia, the history, I guess you could say, of the UFO phenomenon in Australia. Not so much the people looking into it, but the actual phenomenon.
Well, one of the particular things that I've always been interested in is sort of, as you indicated, how long has this phenomenon been going on for? Is it purely something that happened since 1947? And so I took a long kind of particular interest in pre-1947 cases, and I was quickly able to establish that there was a lot of sightings that went back that certainly resembled the kind of thing that was being reported since 1947 right around the world. And sort of two standout cases that were particularly interesting as far as I was concerned was a case that was recorded as occurring as early as 1868, and that involved a Parramatta surveyor. And he was also twice alderman of the Parramatta Council, which was, I guess, the first city that was planned in Australia with the white settlement that took place from 1788. And from that point of view, Parramatta was the first provincial city that appeared in Australia. And so in having a report from a local identity in 1868 was kind of interesting, and this was not your straight up and down sort of sighting of a light in the sky or anything. This was kind of virtually a full-blown sort of contact abduction type case where he was taken on board what he described as a flying ark, which apparently landed in Parramatta Park, and so it was a very interesting kind of case. And I became aware of that in 1975 through a document that purported to be a copy of this original memorandum book that the Parramatta surveyor, Frederick William Birmingham, had written. And so it was part of a fairly intensive investigation to establish that story's credibility as to whether it was an original, authentic historical account or whether it was a much more recent historical hoax. And I was able to establish with a fairly high degree of certainty that this was a real case that apparently had occurred back in 1868. And there was also a daylight sighting that the engineer, Frederick Birmingham, he was a surveyor and engineer, had made as well. And so that gave certainly a rich foundation for, I guess, the historical nature of the UFO experience in Australia. And the other account that really interested me as well was one that occurred in 1927. That's fully 20 years before the modern flying saucer era. And this was certainly very striking. It involved a family, share farming type people that ran a kind of a dairy herd and had pigs and that kind of thing on the property. And it became like almost an early version of the Mothman prophecies being played out in the far north of New South Wales at a locality called Ferndale, and they described seeing lights, disturbances amongst the cattle. Got into a pretty bizarre situation, involved the death of cattle and mutilation of pigs, UFO landing, physical trace event associated with it, strange people appearing on the property, and also strange creatures and that kind of thing. So it was a pretty interesting kind of case that occurred, and I got that story directly from one of the participants, who was a 10-year-old boy at the time.
Wow, that's some wild stuff.
It was an intriguing case because it really, to me, it was very similar in nature to the saga that John Keel and others documented in West Virginia in the mid-60s, and this was a situation that occurred way back in 1927, and it even involved what appeared to be sort of large bird-like creatures, etc., that were being linked by the locals to the mutilation and death of cattle and livestock.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. That's some wild stuff. Is that in the Oz Files?
I do mention that just kind of briefly. It's been written up some while back in Fate magazine, and also in 14 Times, the UK publication.
Nice. I'm going to have to look into that. Now, you've established here some of these cases in the 1800s and the 1900s. Now, what about the way back history of the Aborigines and the pre-European settlers and stuff like that? I presume there were UFO sightings going on back then as well.
Well, obviously, the further you go back in history, the more difficult it is to be certain about what you're dealing with here. And but clearly, amongst Aboriginal lore and legends and that kind of thing, there are things that we sort of UFO researchers and paranormal researchers would perhaps seem to approximate or equate to UFO type of events. And one of the richest traditions is the idea of sky gods and that kind of thing, beings that were involved in sort of leading Aborigines into, I guess, sort of their development of their civilization, that kind of thing. Particularly, a lot of these traditions were linked with what were, I guess, generally referred to worldwide as shaman-type figures or witch doctors, or in Australia they were often referred to as men of high degree, because they were the practitioners of magic and sorcery and medicine, etc., within their particular tribes. And it was these gentlemen that had these rich traditions of shamanic initiations that certainly, when you start to look into them, bear very striking parallels to alien abduction type stories. You know, these were situations where they were kind of abducted by these sky beings and then taken up into aerial realms, etc., and then they would be returned, and quite often they would have special powers, and then they would become the shamans of their tribe.
Huh, wow. Interesting. Now, we all kind of know, I'm sure listeners here kind of know, and I'm sure you do, the sort of evolution of ufology, of UFO phenomenon in America, like since the 1940s onward, how it started with the Foo Fighters and all the different sort of variations and incarnations and stuff like that. How closely would you say that phenomenon, paralleled the American path, if you will, in Australia? Did it, explode onto the scene in the 40s like it did in America, or was it already around earlier, or, how would you say that the path of what's been going on with the UFO phenomenon in the last 60 years has gone?
Well, certainly in Australia, from a local point of view, particularly in terms of what sort of percolated into the public eye and public arena, I guess, it was kind of seen, particularly in those early years from 1947 through to about 1950, as largely speaking an American kind of phenomenon, or an American hysteria, or that kind of thing. That was kind of the take that, I guess, the mainstream media and, I guess, mainstream commentators had of the whole flying saucer subject at that time. It seemed to be like an American phenomenon, but researchers have established that there were a large number of sightings that occurred right from, I guess, the modern era, from 1947 right through to 1950 here in Australia. It just that most of these weren't widely reported, yet they took the same form as most of the UFO sightings from America, and we obviously know with research that this was not just an American phenomenon; it was a worldwide phenomenon, and something that had obviously international dimensions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is what we're doing here tonight.
Yeah, yes. In terms of, I guess, public perception, flying saucers really became big time in Australia in 1950. There was a sort of a large UFO wave, mainly located down in Victoria, and then the first of the major waves of all flaps, or whichever term you'd like to use, took place really in 1954, which was mainly a wave, again, that sort of seemed to be located mainly in Victoria. And it was as if the state was invaded by flying saucers. There were sightings right across the state. There were sightings certainly taking place in other states around Australia as well, but the main focus seemed to be in Victoria during 1954, and that was a kind of a massive wave that took place from the very beginning of January right through January and February, and then seemed to peter out for a while, then took off again around about April, and went through to about May, June, July of that year. And this preceded the big wave of UFO sighting and landing events that took place in France in the latter part of 1954. So certainly, if it hadn't already done so, flying saucer fever really grabbed hold of Australia, particularly in 1954.
Yeah.
There were earlier waves in earlier years like 1952 and 53, but most of these were kind of isolated events, close encounter type events, and few of these got public prominence.
Yeah, like it was building up to that big wave. It seems like back in the day here in America, it was like the cigar-shaped ones, and then it was flying saucers, and then it became black triangles. Has there been any sort of change in as far as what people are seeing?
Well, certainly during the 1954 wave, there were a number of different types of objects being reported, from lights through to circular objects to your cigar-shaped type sightings. The large cigar-shaped ones were often correlated with, in the day, particularly with the kind of more controversial works of George Adamski. These were often regarded by UFO enthusiasts as being the motherships, etc., that sprouted the smaller dish-shaped craft and that kind of thing. The triangular phenomena was not something that came along into the UFO field, even here in Australia, until later decades, and I guess you have your ongoing argument as to whether that represents Earth-based technology or bona fide sort of alien technology. But most of the running of the phenomenon itself, the sightings, roughly approximated what was being sighted and experienced here in America.
Yeah. Now, how about some key cases? We're kind of showcasing Australian ufology here, so I'm sure you have some cases that bear mentioning, I guess you could say, to a predominantly American audience that hasn't heard about Australia. What sort of key cases do you think have happened in Australia that we'd be interested in hearing about?
Yeah, well, recently I was asked by 14 Times to provide a list of what I regard as the 10 best cases, and rather than chasing up the usual international suspects, I stuck to the Australian region with cases that I knew or that I was directly personally involved with in terms of investigation or follow-up, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And one of the best, as far as I was concerned, was one that took place back in 1954. And this is a very impressive case. It was one that got the attention also of people like Dr. Jim McDonald and also J. Allen Hynek. They regarded this particular case as a very impressive case and tried to find out as much as they could about it. Basically, what occurred was that in late August of 1954, a naval pilot, Lieutenant Seamus O'Farrell, was flying a Sea Fury aircraft. He was a naval pilot, and he was doing a routine night flying exercise going across country, and he was near a rural town called Goulburn, which is essentially on the south coast of New South Wales, and he was expecting to have a radio communication from his base, which was Narrow Naval Air Station, within a few minutes, etc. So he was expecting that routine call, and all of a sudden two massive lights appeared that took up positions either side of his aircraft. And the Sea Fury at that time, his aircraft, was regarded as the fastest aircraft flying in Australian skies. So that's fairly significant in terms of what played out in this event. He has these two objects either side, and which was quite startling to him, and he also felt that he was somewhat loath to report this to the ground radio crew at Narrow Naval Station, because he kind of felt that that could affect his credibility and his flying career. So he kind of was in a bit of a dilemma, and then within minutes the unexpected routine call came from Nowra Naval Station, and they went through the routine procedures, etc. And then they were the ones that actually asked him, who have you got up there with you? And his response, and he told me this years later, that he could have kissed those guys. That this was kind of relieved him from the dilemma that he had, that they were actually seeing on radar, ground radar, what he was visually seeing himself. So we have here a very strong correlation between a independently verified radar visual event of two UFOs that had taken up position either side of his aircraft, and the ground radar people were tracking these two UFOs and his aircraft. And so at some point, too, during the actual process, the two objects closed in on his aircraft, and it was at that point that he kind of feared a mid-air collision. As soon as he thought that, the objects seemed to move further out and rejoin their original position either side of the aircraft. So he kind of felt that there was some kind of interplay going on there, but the sighting lasted for several minutes, and then one of the objects crossed directly in front of his aircraft, joined up with the other one, and both of them flew off at high speed. Now, he was very emphatic that here he is flying what was regarded as the fastest aircraft flying in Australian skies at that time, but these two objects left his aircraft as if he was standing still, which was pretty shocking for him as a pilot flying in Australian skies at that time. Now, when he returned to base, he was immediately checked out medically, and then he was debriefed and then interviewed, and the case became a kind of a major case in terms of military investigations, and particularly from the intelligence organisations at the time. It was certainly subject to very intense investigation, and was regarded as a very, very strong case in terms of the credibility of it, but it was certainly kept pretty confidential at the time, even to the point that in the latter part of that year, in December of 1954, the naval minister was at the base as well, and by that stage he was being accompanied by journalists on some sort of routine kind of visit to the base, and the journalists had heard rumours of this story that had occurred in late August of 1954, a few months earlier, and they asked the minister, what did he know about this case? And he knew nothing about it, which certainly rattled him, and that's when the story leaked out in the media, courtesy of the naval minister making some references and demanding information about it. And so he was a very striking case that was very carefully investigated by the military researchers of the day, and I've had the opportunity on many occasions to meet with Seamus O'Farrell, the pilot, and he's an extremely credible witness, and it's one of the best cases of that nature to have occurred in Australia. And in fact, Dr. Hynek regarded as one of the best cases of that kind worldwide.
Nice, yeah, it sounds like a tremendous case. I'm surprised. Is there like a name attached to it in a way? You know, every case seems to have. Is it the Seamus case or something?
It's regarded, often referred to as the Sea Fury case, and I've written it up on my website and in the Oz Files and on various kind of sites as the Sea Fury case. All
right, nice, yeah. So if people want to check out more about the Sea Fury case, they could. But now, what you talked about the 54 wave. How often would you say these waves came about in Australia?
Well, the waves in Australia have a pretty distinct pattern. The first of the waves, as I said, was 1954. There was a major wave during 1957. There was a huge wave, particularly focused around Papua New Guinea, which at that time, in 1959, was a territory of Australia, or a protectorate of Australia. Almost like a colony, that type of situation. That was where the famous Father Gill case was played out at a Anglican mission in Papua New Guinea. This is the Father Gill case, where over 2 consecutive nights he and members of the mission and native tribe people observed a very large aerial object with figures above it, and that there was sort of kind of communication, and these objects came close, or the object came closer, and it was often regarded as one of the best cases of entities being seen with a UFO in terms of recorded history of the subject. And Father Gill, who I've also met on many occasions and interviewed, and tried to get to the bottom of the case as much as I could over the decades, he always struck me as an extremely credible witness, and sadly he died last year, but he was well regarded by people like Alan Hynek and Jacques Vallée and MacDonald as a very, very credible witness, and the case has been highly regarded worldwide. So that's 1959. The further waves occurred in 1963, and one of the biggest waves was between 1965 to 1966. The 1969 was a huge wave of sightings right around Australia. That certainly was my baptism of fire on the local north coast of New South Wales. My hometown area was besieged by UFOs, and even numerous landing sites, marks on the ground, the forerunner of the so-called crop circles, but these were much more credible. They had sort of direct linkages to UFO landing events, that kind of thing. And then after that, 1972, 1975, 1978, you can see from this that there was often something like almost like a 3-year gap between a lot of these major flap years, and that even got people like myself getting into kind of like a kind of a predictive mode that UFO phenomenon would occur in, for example, 1978, and we were kind of anticipating large amounts of sightings, and in fact, 1978 was one of the biggest years, and obviously it was also one of the biggest years for Australian UFO activity to be known worldwide, because most people interested in the UFO phenomenon would be aware of the famous Valentich case of the pilot, Frederick Valentich, disappearing in the wake of a UFO encounter over Bass Strait. That's the big ocean area between Victoria, the southern state, and the island state of Tasmania. He reported for 6 minutes a strange object interacting with him over Bass Strait while he was flying in a Cessna, and then at the end of the conversation there was some strange sound reported during the conversation, and with ground control at Moorabbin in Melbourne, and the pilot and the plane have never been found since. And so it's one of those major mysteries, both in terms of aviation and UFO circles, that resonates worldwide, and it's certainly one of the more striking UFO events in terms of the Australian UFO history. So that was 1978. And certainly since then, the 3-year cycle seemed to become less predictable from that point on. And the next kind of big wave was really, I guess, there were sort of striking events occurring in 1980, but there was events occurring or a big wave in 1983. 85 was a big year, and 87 to a lesser extent, but certainly 1988 was a huge year, particularly with another case that got worldwide prominence from Australia, and that was the Mundrabilla case that involved the Knowles family, a family of a mother and 3 sort of sons who claimed that they were harassed by a UFO driving across the road. It was called the Nullarbor Highway. This huge, long road. It's one of the longest and straightest roads in the world. It runs from outside of Perth in Western Australia right across to Adelaide in South Australia. And it was during that long drive across the Nullarbor Plain that the Knowles family had this encounter with an egg-shaped object that they claimed lifted the car off the road, and it was a very frightening experience, and one that was subjected to a lot of investigation and certainly very intense media attention as well. It was one of those cases. It was one of the first that got subject to, I guess, a form of checkbook journalism. The people were kind of tied up by the media and that kind of stuff, and it often led to difficulties in terms of humble UFO researchers doing an investigation. But it was certainly a very striking case, and it also had the Knowles family being kind of treated like country hillbillies, in the sense that they were being perceived as kind of naive kinds of witnesses, that and that their case got a lot of flack, and a lot of it was very unfortunate and probably not appropriate. But what researchers found was that there were a lot of other UFO sightings going on at that time across the Nullarbor and statewide, and because of the attention or negative attention that the Knowles family were getting, a lot of these reports weren't being made through to the mainstream media, and it was UFO researchers that were picking up on a lot of those stories. And so it was kind of a cautionary tale in terms of people that have these experiences, they were less likely to report it to mainstream media because of that kind of attention that the Knowles family got.
Yeah, that's something we see happening here in America all the time as well.
The 3-year cycle got less predictable. From 88, there were kind of, the 90s were kind of less obvious in terms of waves and that kind of thing. And it was certainly during the late 80s and 90s that the abduction phenomenon, like the United States, became almost centre stage. We had huge numbers of sightings. People like myself and Keith Basterfield, another researcher in Australia, and a number of other researchers had been quietly focusing on abduction-type cases since the late 70s and early 80s, and we kind of noted that there was a kind of an increase in these reports, and certainly by the late 80s, early 90s, these seem to be taking almost centre stage, either rightly or wrongly, in terms of, I guess, the researchers and other commentators on the subject. And so abduction accounts seem to dominate a lot of the attention, just like in America, and that was the case in Australia as well.
Interesting.
And it certainly started to dominate my attention as well in terms of research, attempting to try and see whether there was a physical basis to these UFO accounts, particularly the alien abduction stories.
And so there are a fair share of abductions in Australia as well.
Yeah, well, probably the two most prominent in terms of, I guess, research details was a case that's probably fairly well known to American researchers, and that's the Kelly Cahill case that occurred in the early 90s down in Victoria at a place called Narre Warren. And that was a pretty striking case because, like a lot of researchers who had been examining the alien abduction subject from the 70s and through the 80s, we're all kind of feeling that a lot of the abduction stories told us more about the eccentricities of the human condition than it did about UFO experiences. We kind of felt that there was possibly psychological dimensions to a lot of these tales, etc., and a lot of the abductees were quite credible individuals, but more often than not, there was very little physical evidence for their experiences, and so obviously one was wondering whether or not a lot of this had to do with all sorts of different psychological mechanisms, and that made the Kelly Cahill case from Victoria in the early 90s a very interesting case because here for the first time it seemed we were dealing with a case that not only involved Kelly Cahill and her husband in one car, but also apparently two other separate vehicles, independent witnesses that didn't know each other. There was a second car involved that appeared to have three people in it, and a third car that had one single individual. And all of these people apparently participated in some sort of UFO alien encounter, and certainly for the members of the second car, it also took the form of an abduction experience as well as it did in Kelly Cahill's situation as well. And also reported at the site was apparently physical evidence. Now, this case became a fairly well-documented case in the sense that Kelly Cahill contacted me in terms of trying to get this case investigated. Because I was in New South Wales, I decided to pass or encourage her to get in contact with a Victorian organisation, Phenomena Research Australia, and that was a decision I later grew to regret simply because after more than a decade or so, we still haven't seen the full extent of the data that they claim to have amassed on the case, which was kind of frustrating, particularly from my point of view, because I was kind of interested in this case in particular because it represented possibly one of the first opportunities to have concrete evidence, physical evidence, ground markings, physiological and physical effects on the witnesses. It had a lot of apparent physical dimensions to it, and plus that element of it being independently witnessed by a number of different people, all which could have provided pretty powerful evidence for the objective reality of an alien abduction encounter. So for me as a scientist, I was kind of pretty frustrated by that case because the investigators that I'd passed the case on to pretty much have to this day have not allowed full access to the data they claim to have gathered on the case.
Huh.
So that frustration kind of led me to be a little bit more careful about which organisations and individuals to pass cases on to. And about that same time, another case started to come into prominence, and this was the UFO abduction experiences of a Sydney gentleman by the name of Peter Curry. Now, he had a kind of, I guess you'd call it a classic alien abduction experience that occurred in 1988, very similar to kind of experiences that people like Whitley Strieber reported, claiming to have been subjected to an examination, having entities appear around him and sticking kind of needle-like objects into his head, that kind of thing. It was a very frightening kind of transformative experience for Peter Curry, because at that stage he was a young Lebanese man of a Christian Maronite background who had emigrated to Australia from Lebanon, working in the building industry. He was kind of the last kind of person you'd expect to be coming forth with an experience like this, and indeed he had no context in which to understand his own experience, because it seemed to him to be something that his own family circle thought was something to do with the devil or something like this, or something of that nature. He didn't really know much about alien abductions at that stage, and it wasn't until he saw a big billboard, which was part of a kind of a clever poster campaign to promote the paperback edition of Strieber's book Communion, which had the classic alien grey face on this poster. He's driving past there with past a service station, or petrol station as you would call it in America, and saw this huge alien face. And this is the thing that he had experienced in 1988, a year or two earlier, and he couldn't understand what this was about, because it had the advertising campaign made no reference to the book or anything like that. It was just part of a very clever advertising campaign, and it took about a couple of weeks before they realised that this was about a book, Whitley Strieber's book Communion, and eventually they acquired the book. His fiancée Vivian read the book first, and she said, "Peter, you've got to read this book. This is all about things that you've been telling us about your own experience that you had in 88. And when he eventually did read the book, he found that there were just as many dissimilarities as there were similarities in terms of his own experience. But for the first time, he had some kind of anchor point in which to perhaps try to understand his own experiences that he'd had.
You got a light, buddy?
Yeah, sure, kid. There you go.
And your wallet.
Nick, give him your wallet.
What for?
He's got a knife.
That's not a knife.
You're listening to Binnall of America Audio.
That's a knife.
He began to realise that he'd had earlier experiences, even experiences as a young kid back in Lebanon in the early 70s, that kind of thing. So it was in that context that I got to know Peter Curry, but it was what really became interesting was a 1992 experience that he claimed he had, which involved a early morning experience at about 7 o'clock in the morning. He was actually recovering from a job injury that he had, a fairly severe head injury that he had experienced, and he had was off work, and his wife was the only person making money in the family, so he would drop her off to the railway station so she could go off to work, and he came back at 7 o'clock in the morning. So he clearly was awake at that stage. He got back into bed but wasn't feeling very well, and it was within a few minutes of that, returning to the house, that this experience played out, which is a very bizarre experience. It involved two what appeared to be human-looking females that were both naked that appeared in his house. And he had a pretty confronting experience the long and short of it was that he was left with what appeared to be tangible evidence. That was a blonde hair sample that he connected with one of the strange-looking women that appeared to be like a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Nordic-looking woman. And because he had become aware of the UFO subject up to a point by that stage, he decided that he would keep this hair sample, this blonde hair sample, and it was through that basically, I became involved because it represented an opportunity that here for the first time we had clear biological evidence to examine in what appeared to be an alien abduction experience. And we decided, at probably some risk to Peter's credibility, that we should try and apply a very detailed scientific forensic investigation of this. And I pointed out to Peter that, this held great risks for him because if this hair sample turned out to be entirely normal or prosaic, then he would have a lot of explaining to do, particularly to his own wife by that stage. So it was a pretty bizarre kind of situation, and it was certainly by that stage, and this was getting in towards the late 90s by this stage, because as you can imagine, because of the nature of that experience, this was not something that he was willing to share publicly. Certainly by the mid-90s, Peter had become something of a crusader amongst people that had these sort of abduction experiences, because he had decided, because he had so much difficulty trying to get people like doctors and others to help him out to try and understand his own earlier experience, particularly the 1988 experience, he started to become a bit of a crusader in this area and set up a kind of a support group for people like himself, so that it became easier to try and deal with these experiences. And so he set up a pretty impressive kind of UFO support group, the UFO abductee support group type of thing. It's very similar, I guess, in nature to the kind of support groups that emerged in the United States under people like Bud Hopkins and others to help support people that feel that they've had these sort of experiences. And I got to know a lot of the people involved with this sort of support group, and I was pretty impressed with what Peter had done in terms of setting this up. But one of the things he also tried to do, because he set up this group that had mainstream people, psychiatrists and psychologists and that kind of stuff, mainstream health professionals involved, and even scientists and that kind of thing involved with it, he decided, he would make them aware of this 1992 experience that involved this hair sample. And he found that even then, most of the professionals didn't really cope very well with this experience. They kind of said to Peter, I think it's better you stay with what was regarded as, I guess, consistent kind of alien abduction experience.
A normal one.
Within the norm. And yet, when I learned of this experience a few years later, I realised that here was a chance to kind of verify the reality of these alien abduction experiences. Why not have a look at this hair sample and scrutinise it from a DNA forensic point of view and see if Peter's story stands up? And so by that stage, the late 90s, I had a kind of a private group of scientists, and that group had also expanded to include a number of biochemists. And when I broached the possibility of examining this case with them, I was kind of fully expecting them to recoil and not be interested in investigating this case. And yet, surprisingly, they were very keen, because they realised that irrespective of the bizarre nature of the experience that Peter reported or experienced back in 1992, here was an opportunity to apply a bit of real science to a controversial area to see whether it held up. And so it became a really detailed, long drawn-out and rather costly investigation, but it's something that, in fact, still involves my kind of research focus even to right through to today. So it became one of the more rewarding and more complex and more, I guess, revealing kind of investigations.
Yeah, and I presume I'm going to take a leap of logic here and presume that's where the hair of the alien came from, the book, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah. Plus you've got two hairs going on there. Now, obviously it's still ongoing, but what would you say the findings are so far with regards to the DNA and the forensic evidence you got on this hair?
Well, essentially, that investigation has kind of led to what I regard as a kind of almost a four-phase type of program or of investigation and research. What was regarded as phase one was what I eventually wrote up and reported in the International UFO Reporter, the publication that was put out by the Center for UFO Studies out of Chicago. Back in 1999, they published an article of mine called Strange Evidence, which focused on the first investigation that we did from a DNA point of view. What we did was that we examined the hair sample, or particularly we focused on the shaft of the hair sample. This was a blonde hair sample, and from that, what we gleaned from that was that we got some pretty rare Asian Mongoloid DNA profiles from it, which really was quite puzzling because here we were, the actual Asian Mongoloid DNA sequences were quite rare in the databases that we had available to us out of Asia and China and all other diverse parts there. And with the hair sample, it being blonde, we fully expected it to reveal some sort of, Caucasian-type DNA profile. That's what you'd expect from the hair sample in terms of its appearance, and particularly when you take into consideration who Peter Curry believed was the donor of this hair sample, this blonde, blue-eyed, Nordic-looking woman. So we fully expected to get some sort of routine Caucasian DNA profile, and yet from this we got this rare Asian Mongoloid DNA profile. So that in itself was a pretty inexplicable result, and that's what we reported back in 1999. And that was the first phase. Now we then went on to what we call the second phase, which was to examine the root of the hair sample and to see if we could reconfirm those same results. And what we found was that while we stuck to the shaft of the hair sample and got closer towards the root, we were still verifying this Asian Mongoloid DNA profile. But when we examined the root, we found that, in fact, we were getting a range of different DNA sequences, and these seem to approximate rare Basque Gaelic kind of DNA profiles. Now, this was quite inexplicable because, particularly to the biochemists, and these biochemists that were working with me were biochemists that were quite well known in the field of DNA research, and these were certainly, in particular, the main biochemist working with me was a highly credentialed biochemist, well published in biochemistry journals, even a writer of textbooks and that kind of thing. But he obviously, in terms of career path, was not wanting to have his name directly associated with the investigation because it was obviously seen as a fringe, controversial area, which wasn't going to get him any brownie points in terms of his own peer group. But having this kind of distinct difference between the DNA profile in the root and the DNA profile in the shaft was just a kind of a very striking result, a very bizarre result, and it kind of seemed to go some way to, support the idea that a lot of researchers in this area argue that this is all part of the alien abduction experience. It's all part of some sort of genetic experimentation program to produce some sort of alien-human hybrid. And here in this hair sample, we have what appears to be evidence of a hybrid DNA result. And if you take human hair and indeed any part of the skin, blood, that kind of stuff, you should be getting a consistent DNA profile. Yeah. There are some interesting and obscure DNA properties such as heteroplasmy and others that do generate differences in DNA, particularly in hair and stuff like that. But these are very small shifts in DNA. And yet in this sample, we're getting a very large difference between Asian Mongoloid DNA sequence in the shaft and this rare Basque Gaelic DNA in the root. And so that was very striking. But in addition, we got, through examining the nuclear DNA, we got evidence supportive of another rare DNA property, and that was what's referred to as CCR5 deletion factor. Now, this is a pretty convoluted term, but essentially what it implies is that if you've got this deleted factor in your DNA sequence, you would be immune to things like HIV, AIDS, and things like smallpox. And so it's a pretty interesting, but unfortunately fairly rare DNA sequence or DNA mutation that occurs, and it occurs fairly sporadically particularly amongst Northern European communities, but beyond that it's spread fairly inconsistently and thinly through different communities, but unfortunately it's almost largely absent in Asian communities and African communities where unfortunately HIV and AIDS is very rife. But and that in itself was a pretty unusual set of properties. Here we had the rare Asian Mongoloid DNA in the shaft, the rare bar scalic DNA in the root of the hair. So we had this apparent hybrid type properties associated with the hair sample, and plus this mutation or suggestion of evidence for the mutation that seemed to suggest that the donor of the hair sample was also immune to things like HIV, AIDS, and smallpox, that kind of stuff. So all in this one hair sample. So we're kind of pretty struck and blown away by those results, and that's what was substantially reported as Phase 2 work in the book Hair of the Alien, which came out in 2005. Now, since then, what I call Phase 3 has been to try and understand the nature of some of these DNA sequences, and we were always interested in what was this rare Asian Mongoloid DNA sequence that we'd come across, and so we started trying to figure that out, because most of the there was only a limited number of people that appeared to have that DNA sequence, and the DNA data banks are unfortunately anonymous, particularly more so in the Chinese databases. We were trying to figure out where did that rare Asian Mongoloid DNA sequence come from, and we were able to determine that it appears to be almost unique to a ethnic minority group called the Lahu. This is a native people that are mainly located in northern Thailand and also in southern China, particularly the province of Yunnan, and also in Burma, which is now called Myanmar. So that's the main population area that seemed to have this, and so during 2006, I was involved in a field investigation there in northern Thailand and southern China to examine and investigate and research the Lahu community, and this whole area revealed a lot of other pretty unusual kind of situations, a lot of UFO light phenomena and unusual light phenomena, shamanic type situations amongst the Lahu, even reports of some of their spiritual shaman type people claiming what I guess to the West could be seen as UFO kind of experiences, and things that approximate type of abduction experiences. So it certainly made for some pretty unusual verifications of this, and we were led to this by this hair sample that Peter Curry had recovered back in 1992. So it's a fairly bizarre sequence, but it's a kind of a pretty exotic trail that I'm following, but it certainly doesn't seem to have an end at the moment.
That's an interesting saga. And what just to satisfy my obsessive compulsive disorder, what's the fourth stage? You said you had 4 stages, so what will be the fourth one when you're finished this third?
Well, given one of the things that we were conscious of in terms of the biochemist and myself working together on this was that in amongst the biochemistry community, there's a lot of interesting things that are discussed, etc., within private DNA biochemistry circles, etc., but a lot of unusual kinds of DNA properties and sequences and speculations that go on that generally don't see the light of day in terms of mainstream publication and research, simply because there's not enough compelling evidence, and some of it's pretty weird and out there, and these biochemists have been making me aware of a lot of this kind of data and some unusual correlations and that kind of thing. And so the Phase 4 work is essentially trying to focus on what I regard as kind of the alien DNA paradigm, the idea that while a lot of people feel that the alien abduction experience is something that's pretty difficult to get a handle on, what I've trying to advocate here is that we should be really trying to apply a forensic kind of scientific approach to these experiences, because even if we can't understand the experiences and we can't get a handle of it, if we look at it as a kind of a crime scene, we can at least attempt to try and get their biological signature, so to speak, particularly if this case that Peter Curries has highlighted that, we seem to be dealing, certainly in some cases, of beings that appear to be almost human-like, and this is a thing that's been very prominent amongst experiencers worldwide, that the two most prominent kinds of entities that are reported are your so-called classic grey type diminutive aliens with your large wraparound eyes, that kind of thing, and also these Nordic human-looking people, and this is precisely the kind of thing that Peter Curries' experiences have been highlighting. So this phase 4 investigation is really focusing on this DNA signature, this whole paradigm of looking at whether or not various remote cultures like the Lahu and others have this signature. And because when you start to look at a lot of these primitive cultures worldwide, you find that they're incredibly rich in stories of what appear to be like alien abduction, alien contact type experiences right through a lot of the cultures. And one of the more striking ones is the Bepkaroti story out of Brazil that involves one of the tribes there in the Brazilian jungles that have this tradition of a sky being coming to Earth and imparting to them the rudiments of civilization and that kind of stuff. And they have this annual ceremony of one of the tribespeople dressing up in this straw-like costume that looks for all like a spaceman costume, etc. And they do this every year in their ritual ceremonies, etc. And when asked what was the basis of this, they talk about the appearance of a being that arrived from some sort of skycraft, coming amongst the local tribal people and having what they called a cope, or a sort of a stick-like device that when the various aggressive natives tried to approach this gentleman to try and subdue him, he would shine this thing at them and they would be subdued and literally paralysed. So it was a pretty bizarre story, but this is not unique. There are tribal cultures worldwide that have these kinds of traditions, and that's the focus of this Phase 4 investigation, to examine all those kinds of groups of people to see whether or not there's something to this, because a lot of them claim that they have this deep connection to the point of interbreeding with these people from the skies, etc. So if there's any substance to it, we suspect that maybe we might see some evidence of unusual DNA signatures there as well.
Yeah, nice, interesting. This is a fascinating story, this hair of the alien. Now, has it been vetted by, independent scientists down there? Have they backed up your group's investigation into the DNA?
Yeah, there have been a number of private verifications of it, unfortunately because of the difficulty with the privacy of the primary investigators. They don't want to jeopardise their own careers in mainstream biochemistry. We've been fairly limited in that respect. Because we spread the net open to try and get hold of other samples, because this is only just one case. Obviously, as a scientist, I'd be much more comfortable with this if I had hundreds of cases like this. I've tried to encourage a lot of the seasoned researchers in this field to make available anything that they had that they felt fell within this kind of biochemical or sort of biological kind of sample area. And we've investigated a number of these cases already, and some of them are somewhat well known, I guess, to a certain extent. And in one of those cases was a case that I guess was a bit notorious in the United States, the so-called alien claw case out of California, where a gentleman, a local, I think he was a fire captain or some similar background, that he claimed that he was having a whole series of abduction, alien contact experiences, even claimed to have photographed some of these alien beings and that kind of stuff. And in one experience, he claimed that he recovered what appeared to be the remnants of a claw, an alien claw, so it became known as the alien claw case. And it was when I looked at that, I kind of felt that this was emerging from what I regarded as the hotbed of American ufology, California, that kind of stuff. It had a lot of controversial elements to it, and I was kind of asking some of the more seasoned researchers over there to perhaps do a bit more of a investigation, because I was mindful of the fact that these kinds of investigations, particularly the biochemical ones, are very time-consuming, very expensive, and it can be quite sort of daunting to undertake, etc. So rather than get involved with it and then find that it didn't have much going for it, I was kind of seeking some independent verification. And that's how we got to know Dr. Cole Kellner, who was part of the NIDS organisation. That's the National Institute for Discovery Science. It's an organisation that was put together by Robert Bigelow. Now, Cole Kellner, fortunately, had a very good, strong background in biochemistry, and that allowed a bit of private consultation between the biochemists working with me and Cole Kellner himself, and he was able to, he was very impressed with the work that was done by the biochemists here on the Pedicuri case, and therefore he was kind of willing to undertake a little bit of an investigation into the alien claw case, and ultimately he got to a stage where he felt, well, there may well be something worthwhile here, and decided to encourage the NIDS organisation to support DNA work that we undertook here. And so eventually, to cut a long story short, with I guess the support of people like Dr. Roger Lear, who was involved with the case, and Cole Kellner, we were able to get samples of the alien claw sample sent to us here in Australia, and we undertook an investigation of that. And it became a very detailed and complex investigation because we were concerned about the provenance of the sample and also how credible this sample was, and it became ultimately a bit of a cautionary tale, because initially the initial round of DNA investigation we undertook with the sample highlighted that we seemed to be getting some pretty bizarre results, but obviously we wanted to replicate them as we did in the Pedicuri case.
Yeah.
And when we tried to replicate the testing again, that was just standard procedure in this kind of DNA work, we weren't getting the same sets of results. And we thought something's going on here that we hadn't fully accounted for, and that's why we then tried to get further investigation done into the provenance of the sample and to more closely examine the sample. And when we started to do that, we found that what we were dealing with here, when we started to do some fairly detailed investigation here, we found that maybe we weren't dealing with a claw as suggested by the original researchers, but something a little bit more prosaic. And eventually, once we realised this, we had to develop brand new DNA primer techniques to do all this work. So that in itself was a bit of a breakthrough. But ultimately, when we did that and made allowances for this, we got very consistent results, and those consistent results confirmed that what we're dealing here wasn't an alien claw, but in fact a prosaic earth-based snail or a mollusk.
Oh man!
And we were getting very consistent results with that, and we felt that that was further endorsement of the power of the whole DNA technique. That if you apply sufficient controls to the process and establish the credibility of the sample in the first place, then DNA forensic techniques apply a very powerful tool to trying to come to some sort of understanding of what's going on here. And so in this case, while it doesn't necessarily invalidate the whole case out of California, it does kind of provide a pretty prosaic, mundane explanation for this sample that the witness thought was involved with his experience. So it was a pretty good investigation from a researcher scientific point of view, even though it was a fairly exhausting investigation. So it was essentially a cautionary tale in terms of investigations, and these are very complex investigations, and yet it provided a good, positive, solid result. So that didn't faze the researchers in the sense that we obviously just wanted to get an answer one way or another. So the Curie case was still the only one that we felt had a very strong result associated with it. We got involved with the famous Betty and Barney Hill case as well. In that case, this is the classic case out of 1961 that's become quite famous in terms of alien abductions research and the history of the subject. In that case, Betty Hill had her dress that she wore during that experience had an unusual stain on it, and it was always something that interested people, but was never investigated in any depth. And that dress remained in Betty's closet for decades, and then eventually it came to the attention of Phyllis Buddinger, who is a chemist like myself, and she was interested in trying to do some physical chemistry work on this, and ultimately the work that she did on it seemed to imply that this stain had possibly evidence of amyloids attached to it, and because of that, she felt it might have been a possible good candidate for DNA work. And because of the good work that she did, we felt that, yes, this would be an extremely worthwhile thing to do. And ultimately, we eventually got samples of the dress and started doing DNA work on it. But what we found here, none of it was evidence of anything alien. What we found was that the unusual pink stain appeared to be related to spider's blood. And there was also evidence of DNA that was Ethiopian in nature, which we felt correlated to Barney Hill, her husband, who was a African American person in terms of nationality.
Yeah.
So that in itself highlighted once again the power of the DNA technique to come up with some sort of, grounding of the result or the situation. Here we had this dress that may have been good evidence. It would have been fantastic to have applied this technique back in the early 60s, but unfortunately the DNA techniques were just not available then, of course.
Yeah.
As for spider's blood on Betty's dress, we're not sure about that, but it appeared that the technique was powerful enough to suggest that the spider's blood was local spider's blood to the New Hampshire area. So we even had that ability to come that far with it. So
wow.
We felt that maybe somehow she'd sat on a spider or had come into contact, and the spider had been killed, and the blood had appeared on the dress that way, and so that might have been part of the answer for this stain that appeared on Betty Hill's dress. So,
there you go.
So that was another case. So we've looked at a couple of other cases, but none of them have revealed results as good as and as strong as the Peter Curry case.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a fascinating.
But it also, through all that process, it allowed, I guess that's a long-winded answer to your question about verification or duplication of the results. We've had the opportunity of people like Cole Kellner to at least look at the quality of the work that has been done in the Curry case, and also particularly the kind of work that we did in the Alien Claw case, that kind of thing. And he was pretty impressed with the work that was done.
We've put a lot of time here into discussing, the history of the UFO phenomenon in Australia. Now let's sort of dive into some of the other pillars of Australian ufology. And the first thing I want to talk about is Australian ufology. That history of organized UFO studies. We had it here in America. We have it, obviously, NICAP, APRO, MUFON, sort of that evolution of groups. Some of them grow, some of them die. I guess just talk about the history of organized UFO studies in Australia. You have a nice little piece on your website about it, and talk a little bit about Edgar Gerald and his strange story in general.
Right. Well, Edgar Gerald was regarded as, I guess, the father of Australian ufology.
We're going to leave you on that cliffhanger to make sure you come back next week for part 2 of the Bill Chalker interview. For now, that does it for this week's edition of BOA Audio Season 3. Big, super huge thanks to Bill Chalker for coming on the show. Of course, as noted here with the cliffhanger, he'll be back next week to talk about more Australian ufology. We're going to be talking about the history of Australian UFO studies from both the government and the civilian perspective, the role of the media, the role of the military, and the perspective of the everyday people in Australia with regards to UFOs, plus some discussion on the Chinese UFO scene that you are not going to want to miss. All that's next week on the program with Bill Chalker. Until then, you definitely want to check out Bill's websites, www.theozfiles.com and ozfiles.blogspot.com. Check those out. Lots of great information on the Australian UFO scene, courtesy of Bill Chalker. Moving right along now, it's time for BOA Audio listener feedback. And this week we have less of a comment or a question, more of a plug, but I found the material pretty intriguing, so we'll throw in the plug here. This plug comes from Rao Draco, and here's what he has to say. Tim, I am one of your listeners. I am Rao, the creator of Cosmic Communism. I have created a new ideological movement that fuses communism, spirituality, deep ecology, and extraterrestrial civilizations. You may be interested in my perspective on UFOs. And then he lists about 5 blogs, but just to keep it short and sweet, I'll just give you the first one. You can check that one out. Use that to jump to the other websites. The blog is cosmiccommunism.blogspot.com. Check that out. Check out the cosmic communism movement that Rao has created. And he signs off on the letter Namaste. There you go, Rao. Hopefully the BOA audio listeners, of which you are one, as you say here in the letter, will check out cosmiccommunism.blogspot.com and dive into the world of cosmic communism. I'm definitely going to be checking it out in the next few weeks to see what it is all about and see maybe if we can talk to Rao on the program at some point in the future. If you would like to be a part of BOA Audio listener feedback, you got a question, a comment, maybe a plug like Rao here, any of that stuff, it's cool with me. We'll put it on here at the end of the program. Here's how you go about contacting me. You can either write to boaaudio@hotmail.com or go to binnallofamerica.com and click the contact button at the bottom of the menu on the left-hand side of the screen. Or you can join up at the official BOA forum, theusofe.com, theusofe.com. Check it out. It's free to register. It's free to become a member. And that is where not only myself, but the great BOA staff and a ton of great BOA readers and listeners and supporters hang out and discuss all things esoteric and not so esoteric, like the NBA playoffs and the TV show Lost. We got a lot of great threads going on about that stuff, plus lots of discussion on the world of the paranormal and paranormal media. Either one of those 3 methods is a means to an end, the end being getting your correspondence onto BOA Audio listener feedback. Up next, you guessed it, it is the thanks portion of the show. Allow me to give a heartfelt and sincere thanks to the fantastic BOA staff: Leslie, Chiron, R. Lee, Joe V, Tina Senna, Rochelle Hawks, and Richard Thomas of Wales. Big time congratulations also this week to Leslie on 3 years of writing for BOA with the weekly column Gray Matters. Leslie has been integral to the success of BOA over the last 3 years. We would be a shell of what we are today without her support, friendship, and contributions to the website. And I want to take a moment here to say thank you, Leslie, for your continued commitment and support of BOA. Congratulations on 3 years, and here's to another great year of Gray Matters at Binnall of America. I say it week in and week out, but I repeat it over and over again because it's the truth, my friends. If you're only listening to BOA Audio and you're not reading the columns at binnallofamerica.com, you're only getting half the story. Top-notch reading material, day after day after day, courtesy of the outstanding BOA staff. binnallofamerica.com, make it a part of your everyday search for esoteric news and opinion. Now, chances are you've already finished listening to the first part here of the Bill Chalker interview. I must point out, of course, that you've just heard an hour-long phone call to Australia. You're going to hear the other hour and a half next week on the program. That's a 2.5-hour call to Sydney, Australia. My friends, that costs a pretty decent chunk of change. It's also, I believe, our 5th international call of the season so far. We had Nick Pope in the UK, Christo Lowe in South Africa, Gildas Bordes in Paris, France, and Dr. Bob Curran in Ireland. That is a plethora of international phone calls, and as you can expect, that's a plethora of international phone call bills that come my way. Those bills are paid for by yours truly with the help of supportive BOA listeners who make donations. How can you make a donation? That's simple. You go to binnallofamerica.com, click the PayPal button. That'll take you to PayPal and facilitate your donation. No donation is too small, and all donations go towards keeping Binnall of America and Binnall of America Audio up and running and freely available for all of our great listeners and readers the world over. It's no big secret, next week on the program we're going back to the island of Australia, my friends, of course, with Bill Chalker Part 2. It is the second installment of our ultra-long-distance conversation with the Australian ufologist Bill Chalker, as we cover the history of Australian UFO studies from both a civilian and government perspective. We'll hear about the fascinating story of Edgar Gerald, and also Bill's examination of the official Australian UFO files. We'll discuss the media's coverage of the UFO phenomenon in Australia and how the general public feels about unidentified flying objects in the land down under. On top of all that, we'll talk about the world of Chinese ufology, an area that Bill has been investigating over the last few years, and get a glimpse into this mysterious world of UFO research. All that and, of course, tons and tons more, standing alongside our examinations of South Africa and France. It's another eye-opening look at the world of UFO studies across the globe. That's next week, part 2 of Bill Chalker talking about Australian Ufology on BOA Audio Season 3. And on that note, we close it out here for the week. Thank you so much for listening, folks. Thank you for your support of BOA Audio. It is greatly appreciated. Until next week, this is Tim Binnall, signing off.